Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Clark McCauley. He is a research professor of psychology and co-director of the Solomon Asch Center for the Study of Ethnopolitical Conflict at Bryn Mawr College. His research interests include the psychology of group identification, group dynamics and intergroup conflict, and the psychological foundations of ethnic conflict and genocide. He is founding editor of the journal Dynamics of Asymmetric Conflict, Pathways Toward Terrorism and Genocide, and is also the author of several books, including Why Not Kill Them All? The Logic and Prevention of Mass Political Murder, Friction, How Conflict Radicalizes Them and Us, and the Marvel of Martyrdom, The Power of Self-Sacrifice in a Selfish World. So, Dr. McCauley, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
My great pleasure.
Okay, great. So, basically today we're going to focus our conversation on the mechanisms behind the political radicalization at several levels. We're going to talk about three different levels: the individual, the group level, and the mass level. So first I would like to ask you, why is it important for us to have this approach in terms of political radicalization that subdivides it into three different levels, and to what extent do they interrelate with one another?
Well, it's important because if you leave out any one of them, you won't understand the phenomenon of interest. So that's a good reason. And yes, you should think of them as related. In fact, you should think of them as nested. So the individual level perseveres at the group level, is nested within the group level, and the group level is persevering and nested within mass political or mass opinion level. So yes, they are related. It's still important to distinguish them because the individual level, for instance, is the level that helps us best understand the peculiar circumstances of the lone wolf terrorist, who does not have a group with behind him or her.
Right, and I mean, many times it's a bit tricky to know if we should address a particular social phenomena by trying to understand things as they happen at an individual and perhaps psychological level, or perhaps at a social level, right? Because, I mean, even when we talk about groups and societies, they are still composed of individuals, right?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. But it's not possible to understand political conflict in particular, focusing only on the individual level. That was an idea from maybe 30 years ago, maybe back in the 80s, that there was something psychologically disturbed or wrong, or to put it in everyday terms, crazy, about individuals who would kill women and children and civilians in the name of a political cause. So there was a time when the focus was all at the individual level. That turned out to be wrong in several ways. It's wrong because most people who get involved in terrorism are psychologically normal, but it's also wrong because we can't really understand the progression to extreme behavior, focusing only on the individual level. There's almost always some kind of a militant group involved, and it's the group dynamics in that group that are an important part of understanding how normal people can be brought to see doing terrible things as not only acceptable, but necessary and desirable.
Okay, so in your work you talk about these three different levels: the individual, the group, and the mass levels. and you identify 13 mechanisms, some of them that fall mostly under the individual level, others the group level, and still others under the mass level. So starting with the individual level, what would you say are perhaps some of the most important mechanisms that we would have to understand in order to operate, to understand how individuals get politically radicalized?
Well, the obvious beginning is a group grievance, perception that a group that you care about is being victimized and suffering, and you have an idea who the perpetrators are, and you're ready to do something back to you could say it's revenge, you could say it's justice, you could say that it's making a difference, maybe helping the victims by fighting back.
Right.
So that's the obvious one. But there are other ways in which individuals come to join a militant group. And one of those is personal grievance. I mean, some people join a militant group because the group is fighting somebody that has hurt personally the individual, or has hurt personally the individual, or those the individual is close to, family, friends, like that. So that's to be distinguished from a political grievance. Right. Because lots of people with a political grievance have no personal grievance. They've never been injured or victimized or suffered themselves personally, but they care about people who have been victimized, as they see it anyway. So it's important to distinguish the personal grievance from the political grievance, because every now and then you find somebody say, well, you know, this is not possible that this person has a grievance, because this person is, you know, they're well-to-do, they're educated, they got a job, they got family, their life is pretty much okay. So how could we say that such a person has a grievance? And the answer is because human beings are capable of caring about a large group, most of whom are personally strangers, and this is a wonderful thing about human beings.
Most of them are strangers, but they still have to share a group identity, right?
Yes, well, what it means to identify with a group is to care about what happens to that group. And you don't have to be a member of that group. You don't even have to be the same ethnicity or the same nation or the same religion. I mean, some people can care about suffering even when it's nothing to do with them or anybody that they know, which is a wonderful thing, which is another way to think about that, is that at the bottom of all intergroup conflict and intergroup violence is love.
Right.
It's not hate. It's love. It's love for those that the individual sees as being victimized and suffering. So something most people aren't ready to think about is that it's not, it
doesn't have to entail some sort of negative emotion necessarily.
Well, no, it usually does have some negative emotion, some hostility, maybe even hatred for the group that is perceived as the perpetrators of this suffering.
Right.
But you have to understand that that is like a reflection. It's not an independent motive. People don't wake up hating one day. It's because they love. And then they come to see the loved ones as suffering and victimized. And then that some people feel like they have got to do something about that. So anyway, we're talking about a couple mechanisms, but there are other ones. Some individuals will join a militant group because they always wanted the status and the power of a gun in their hand.
Right.
People will join a militant group because they're escaping from some bad news in their own lives. Maybe the police are after them. Maybe their family has disowned them. Maybe they've lost their job and have nowhere to go and no friends. So these are all reasons for joining a militant group that have nothing to do with a grievance, nothing to do with ideology. And some people will join a militant group, again, for an aspect of love, because they know somebody who is already a member of the militant group, and that person asks them to come and help. For many individuals, it's enough. They don't need a strong feeling of grievance. They don't have to be political. They could have been completely politically neutral up to the point where somebody they love asks them, come, we're doing this, come and help me and help us. So that's enough of a reason for some people. And then there's some people who join for...
because they feel socially disconnected, for example?
Yeah, because it's just an accident that they ran into a militant group at a time when their social life was empty and they had no connections. And here's a group of people who offer them connection and friendship and comradeship. We call that unfreezing, actually, as a mechanism. So most of us are kept in the bounds of the everyday by all kinds of everyday connections. So we have family, we have friends, we have coworkers, we have neighbors, we have people we play tennis with. And all of these everyday connections help keep us in a normal frame of behavior. But when we lose that, a lot of it, all at once, especially, suddenly, then we're looking for some place, some people, some new group to join. And if that group happens to have values that are militant values, well, that's the way it happens. I mean, you might some people join, they could have just as easily joined a cult, a religious cult. If they'd run into some cult people at the same time when they ran into these militants, they would have joined this religious cult. So it's just an accident for some people. At a time when they're disconnected, they run into some members of a militant group, and this group offers them membership and belonging, and friendship and comradeship, and that's enough. So notice that we've now been talking about quite a number of mechanisms, most of which don't really have anything particular to do with politics.
Right.
Not political. The group grievance, that's political. But personal grievance and escape and love for somebody who's already in it, and disconnection and joining for comradeship, joining for status and power, and having a gun in your hand. These are reasons for joining that have really nothing political about them, nothing ideological about them. And so it's really important to realize that lots of people join a militant group, a terrorist group, for reasons that have nothing to do with political issues or conflicts. Now, after they join, of course, they learn some. Right. They learn a story. They learn a narrative. They learn a group grievance, but that's not the reason they joined up in the first place.
And the fact that it's not always political, at least to starting off with, because I mean, there are situations where people perhaps simply feel socially disconnected and they feel the need to belong to a group and to feel connected with other people and to feel that they have some relevance and that their lives are relevant, and perhaps they adhere to certain movements at the extreme because in certain situations perhaps they think that they haven't got anything to lose anymore even, and that's perhaps why they sometimes offer themselves to commit some extreme acts.
Well, I think they're not really considering when they're first getting connected with members of this group. I don't think they're really thinking about relevance in their lives. That's too abstract. They're thinking about, I feel lonely.
Okay.
I don't have friends. Maybe I moved to a whole new city or another country. No friends, no connections. I don't have good work or interesting work. And so I'm really interested to meet some people and to get some connections. It's more like that.
Mm-hmm. And then at the group level, a very interesting phenomenon that I read about in your books is that there are several groups that they don't really start off as radical political groups, but over time and through several steps they radicalize. Right.
Yeah, as a group, all at once. Mm-hmm. So at the individual level mechanisms I was talking about, well, here are some of the reasons, some of the pathways by which an individual might join a militant group. Mm-hmm. But then there's another kind of radicalization that happens when a whole group of people as a whole becomes more extreme, more radical over time and moves to violence. So we've got plenty of examples of that. Back in the 1970s in the US of A, the Weather Underground emerged out of the Students for a Democratic Society, which had like tens of thousands of members on campuses around the country. And they marched and they demonstrated and they sat in and they were trying to get the U.S. to leave the war in Vietnam and stop invading Cambodia. And also, they were against racism here at home. So they had these idealistic concerns for which they were activists. An activist is somebody who's doing something political, but not violating the law, or at least not violence. It's not doing violence. So they were activists, and they were getting nowhere. And the high end of these people who knew one another very well, the leadership of the SDS is who it was, really. Over a period of time, they saw they were getting nowhere. They were getting beat up by police. They're getting put in jail, and their cause was going nowhere. And the U.S. was not getting out of Vietnam, and racism was not disappearing. And some people kind of just dropped out and gave up. But the leadership element especially were so committed that they felt like they had to do something. And what they decided was they needed to, and this is their phrase, bring the war back home. Mm-hmm. So that people in the U.S. could see what it was like to be on the receiving end of violence. So they went underground and started a bombing campaign with some success in terms of setting off bombs in interesting places, including in Washington, D.C. But they're an example. My point is, these are an example of people who were already known to one another. They were close. They were interacting. They were the leadership element. And they, as a group, over a period of time, in a back and forth with government security officers, mostly police, back and forth, they escalated their activities from the legal to the illegal sit-ins and illegal marches to finally going underground in actual violence campaign, bombing campaign. So this is
there's also a sort of,
I mean, it's a different feeling to the people involved, as opposed to one individual or me and my friend deciding we're going to join an existing militant group. This is how a militant group came to be.
Mm-hmm. So there's also a slippery slope kind of process occurring here, or not?
Yes, you could say a slippery slope. It's I have talked about it as a slippery slope. I think today I think about it more as a mechanism of escalation. Mm. We do this, they do that back to us. We do more, they do more. And the course of this is very much fraught with emotion. You probably know from your many outreaches to the academic world that the predominant view in political science and sociology and even some parts of psychology, the predominant view is a kind of a rational choice view, that people do things because they have plans, because they want certain goals, and they do things that they think will get them, they expect will get them to those goals. This is, I believe, a totally inadequate way of thinking about how people come to political violence. People come to political violence in emotion. When you read case history materials, what was it like to be in one of these groups? What was it like to be in the Weather Underground? back in the 70s. What was it like on the way into going underground? These meetings they had and the interactions they had with the police. It was very much up to your elbows in emotions. And, there's anger, and outrage, there's shame. We're not making any progress. We're not succeeding. Humiliation. Mm-hmm. Oh, they've done these things to us and the people we care about, and there's nothing we seem to be able to do about it. So to understand how individuals and whole groups move to violence, you have to be ready to look at emotions. You can see the same thing at the mass level. I mean, you look like maybe a little young to have been paying much attention back in 9/11 days, but the U.S. reaction to the attacks of 9/11 was not thoughtful, not planful, not expected value-oriented, not rational choice. It was extreme emotion.
Right.
And humiliation. Who are these nobodies that have done this to us? Mm-hmm. Anger.
Mm-hmm. And that occurred most at a mass level.
Yeah, at every level. I mean, at the individual level, some people quick ran down and signed up to join the army. It was a big rush of enlistments. So you could say that's the individual level. Mm-hmm. And then at the group level, we've got people responding inside the government as part of some kind of security group. And you get to see the kind of extremism that produced arguments, well, we have to use torture because these people are terrible and they deserve it. And, the fact that most of the people being tortured are actually innocent did not slow us down at all. Mm-hmm. So,
and that's perhaps some of the reasons why people tolerated a little bit more those kinds of approaches.
Yeah, it's emotion. If 9/11 hadn't happened, we never would have had Harvard professors issuing learned essays in favor of torture. Right. We never would have had the U.S. government getting a Department of Justice memo justifying torture. I mean, these things would never have happened. And it didn't happen because people sat down and thought to themselves, well, we've got this problem. What are we going to do about it? Well, I guess one of our best tools would be torture, so I guess we should do that. It wasn't like that. It wasn't like thinking about who is the enemy, how are we going to respond to them, what is the answer to the problem we're facing. It wasn't like that. It was, we got to get back at these people. Mm-hmm. And if we got to do some horrific things along the way, well, but it's what would make that kind of a difference? It's emotion, it's anger, it's outrage, it's humiliation, it's fear of the next attack. All of these things together, these emotions together, it's what made it possible to have a turn toward torture that never would have occurred in the absence of 9/11.
Mm-hmm. So isn't it the case that when societies or people go through political or social instability, like, for example, an economic crisis, or more recently, a migratory crisis, at least people call it that. I'm not sure if objectively speaking, the way people think about it is really a crisis, in the sense that, we're receiving too many people. I mean, we can't deal with all these people. I'm not sure if that's the correct way to think about it or not, but at least people respond to certain levels of threat and to different types of threat as they are exposed to information, either directly or through media and things like that. But anyway, there are those sorts of things that happen at a social level that also might lead people or groups that are already formed toward political radicalization, right? And I'm asking you that because it seems to me that at least some of that might be behind what we're seeing nowadays in terms of more extreme groups, political groups, both on the right and the left, developing and becoming more salient, politically speaking, because it's much harder in situations of instability for people that act in a more moderate way to be taken seriously by people who are politically motivated, because it's easier for them to not trust people who are moderate because they think that perhaps they are part of the other group or the other side of the political spectrum. So does all of these make sense or not?
Well, I think there are several different kinds of threat that get involved in the reaction to refugees and immigrants. Mm-hmm. There's a material threat.
Right.
Some people see or believe or are told that these people are going to take our jobs. They're going to undermine our standard of living. Mm-hmm. So that's a material threat. For some, it's a status threat. So there's enough of these people now that, our cities don't even feel like our own anymore. I mean, there's minarets rising up as cathedrals are diminished. So for some, it's a status inversion threat. For some, it's actually even an existential threat. Well, these people, they're so numerous and they breed like rabbits, and pretty soon we're going to be a minority in our own country. And once they get control, we're probably not going to survive. Our people, our culture, we're not even going to survive. So for some people, it goes as far as being existential threat. And then there's a fourth kind of a threat that most people, I think, don't give enough attention to, and it's a threat of contamination. These people have a different essence than we do. At the bottom of this view of a threat is the perception that groups of people have essences. The essence is the hidden something in living things that makes them what they are. So, a bluebird has a different essence than a penguin, and you can use that same kind of thinking to talk about human beings. You could say, well, individuals have essences. Mm-hmm. I have an essence. I'm the same essence that I was when I was 5 years old, though nobody who knew me then would recognize me now. In fact, I can hardly even recognize myself. My appearance and behavior has changed to such an extent. So individuals are seen as having essences. And then we can go on and see whole groups of people having essences. Americans have an essence. British have an essence, or at least the English have an essence. God only knows whether it's the same as the Scots, probably not. The same as the Welsh, probably not. And then the people of Portugal have an essence. We have a history. We have a culture. We have food and wine that is ours, and land that is ours. And to get the wrong kind of essence in our midst is contaminating us. So the same way the cockroach who dips a toe into your juice is contaminating, and you don't want to drink the juice anymore, a foreign essence of people dipped into your essence of your people can be seen as contaminating. And if you want to see that kind of thinking really large, you can go back and read Mein Kampf, because that was Hitler's view of the Jews. Mm-hmm. They were contaminating. They were like some kind of a terrible bacillus or rats, something ugly with a bad essence that was contaminating the German people. So that's a fourth kind of a threat. So I think all four of those kinds of threat, in different proportions in different people, are part of what gets the reaction to refugees and immigrants.
Mm-hmm. So that kind of essentialist thinking that people have is what goes associated with processes of dehumanization, for example.
Yes, it is, in my opinion, a superior way of thinking about dehumanization. I mean, it's one thing to say, well, they're not really human, but it's a deeper thing, I believe, a more useful thing to say. They're not human because they don't have the same essence we do. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's a cognitive psychology developing in the last 20 years, people studying essence, and what that means, and how people come to have ideas of essence, and when they choose to employ those ideas. And so anyway, there's a whole psychology of essentializing in the last 20 years, which I think gets deeper than just saying it's not that dehumanization is wrong. Yes, it's correct to say that there are some peoples that we believe are not really human, same as we are, but it's quite another thing to say that there is this deep down cognitive human capacity to see the world in terms of essence, and it's kind of a default, and it has these characteristics that a bad essence is not fixable. Mm-hmm. You can't train it away. You can't educate it. It's like if you think broccoli, as one of our presidents used to say, but, you know, broccoli has a bad essence, then it can't be sauced over. There's nothing you can do except separate yourself from it. And that means either they got to go, right? We got to move. And of course, we'd rather they move. So that's where you get ethnic cleansing, is out of this desire to separate from the contaminating. And if you can't get them away from you, you know, Hitler's first idea was to send the Jews off to Mozambique or some place in Africa, I've forgotten where. So the first idea was, we'll just get rid of them. But then comes the war, and it's not possible to get rid of them. So what's the only other way to get rid of them? We got to kill them.
Mm-hmm. So it's not that the other people completely lose any sort of essence, but simply that we attribute them an sort of non-human essence. It could even be an essence that we attribute to a lower animal toward which we feel even things like disgust.
Yeah, exactly. Animal life is a frequent interpretation of a bad essence. It's not the only one, but it's a commonplace one. Yeah, they're like rats. Mm-hmm. They're like cockroaches.
Or cockroaches, like Hitler characterized the Jews, right?
Yeah, well, and like the Hutu characterized the Tutsi.
Right.
Or it's a bacillus. Mm-hmm. It's a virus. Mm-hmm. So these are all images of a kind of a lower form of animal life, which is very dangerous and contaminating.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, for people that might be listening or watching this, it might seem a bit scary, and perhaps there are good reasons for us to think that it is, because it seems that all of these cognitive mental processes occur in virtually everyone across the world. I mean, everyone could be subject to these kinds of mental processes or mental mechanisms, right?
Yeah, psychologists go around the world looking to see which are the emotions that can be found in every society, mm-hmm. in the highlands of New Guinea as well as in the city of Tokyo. Right. And there's some emotions that you find everywhere. Mm-hmm. There's anger, there's sorrow, there's happiness, and there's disgust. Everywhere there is disgust. Now, it is true that different societies feel disgusted by different things.
Sure.
But you might say the apparatus of disgust, the cognitive and emotional apparatus of the experience of disgust, you find that everywhere. Mm-hmm. And the hallmark of disgust is contamination. Mm-hmm. So when I'm talking about this contaminating threat, I'm basically talking about a group that is seen as disgusting. Mm-hmm. A whole group, disgusting.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I was saying that that this sounded scary because it's not that people that go through these processes have some sort of mental disorder. I mean, these are
Oh,
this is part of a normal brain. Right.
absolutely. These basic emotions are part of the human equipment everywhere, in every society, in every culture. It's completely normal.
Right.
So you could say it's scary to recognize that some of the aspects of human normality can be so easily turned to conflict and violence. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the scary part of things here.
But
So,
I like to think about it this way. At the bottom of it always is love for the in-group. So
right.
when you think about how these perception of these threats from others, including the contamination threat, when you think about how the power of that is the degree to which we care about others, great enormous numbers of others who are strangers to us, I mean, that's a wonderful human capacity. This capacity for sympathy and empathy and caring about others who are not our friends and relatives. We don't know them personally. I mean, there's 300 plus a million Americans. How many of them do I know? I might know 100 of them or something. So in a way, it's an enormous and wonderful human capacity, this capacity for caring about large and abstract groups. It's one, but the downside, it's like the flip side of it is any perception of threat to these people that I care about, this identity that I have, this identification that I have, any threat can produce this kind of reaction. So I don't know. I tend to think of it as like the glass half full and half empty. It's scary how normal are the psychologies that get bound up and turned into intergroup violence. But somehow it also seems to me wonderful and reassuring that human beings have this capacity to care so much, so easily.
And when it comes to group violence, I would like to ask you about this because I've had Dr. Martin Daly on the show, and we talked about how particularly young men, and when they are part of certain social economic circumstances, like if they are low in the social hierarchy and they don't have access to a lot of material resources, let's say, they are in fact the ones that are more prone to really seeking these sorts of actions, particularly the more violent ones. That is, if they join political groups and they radicalize, it is the young men, the ones that are most likely to commit violent acts, right?
Well, you don't want to go too far with that. Statistically, it's true that violence is more associated with men than with women, but so we've had leaders like Ulrike Meinhof was one of the two paramount leaders of the Red Army faction, the Baader-Meinhof gang in the 70s in Germany. So as a statistical tendency, yes, violence is in pretty much every society that's been studied, I think. I'm sure that's what Daly was talking with you about. Violence is more associated with men, but you got to be careful not to overinterpret that. It's not that we don't find some women involved in violence, because we do. It's just less likely statistically. So now, as to whether or not it has to do with their status, I don't know. I'm thinking about who joins the army. Is it the poorest, least educated members and males? Well, I'm not so sure. What I am sure about is modern armies have such requirements. Requirements in terms of teamwork and requirements in terms of cognitive ability. They won't take people, they won't take males or females from the bottom half of the distribution of, you'd say broadly, socioeconomic status. They don't want those people. They're not smart enough, and they don't know how to work together well enough, and they can't be part of a modern complex army. So now, would the least males in the U.S. who have the lowest education, the lowest IQ, the lowest skills, would they join the army if the army would take them? I don't know. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure.
Well, perhaps they would prefer violence, but in the context of gangs or something like that, instead of violence that is more associated with politics.
Well, more associated with state power, anyway.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, but see, as you're talking, I mean, I've heard this idea before about how it's the males with the least advantages who are most prone to
violence.
To violence and joining in violence. Well, I mean, if you look at crime statistics, I think that's certainly true. But why is it true? Is it because they're... See, I'm not a criminologist, but the line that I would want to be thinking about here is a kind of a criminology line. Well, what kinds of violence are the least advantaged males caught up in? When you get a crime statistic for assault or something, how does that happen? Is it because they're seeking status? I think more likely it's because their status has been challenged, especially in a bar. Somebody disrespects them. And then they feel compelled to respond at the end with violence in order to protect their status as a man, as a male, as a person of honor, and so on. So I wouldn't, that's like status preserving, under threat to status, but it's not exactly status seeking. Mm-hmm. It's not they get into fights in bars because they want to have the status of being the best fighter. It's more like they see violence as the only answer to preserving their honor and their status, and it's thrust upon them more than sought. So anyway, you see, I'm feeling a little complicated about this. Yes, I think it's true statistically that it's the least favored, least educated, least advantaged males in America who show up the highest in the violence statistics. But whether that can be translated into a motivation for status through violence, you see, I'm having some trouble with that. I'm not so sure that's the right way to think about how they get involved in violence. But I'm not an expert on this, and Daley, who you've already spoken to, is an expert, so probably I ought to back right out of this and say, I got some doubts about this, but really, since I'm not an expert, I probably should give up on this law.
Well, fair enough. Anyway, perhaps this doesn't have any direct link with politics or group political radicalization or something like that. It's just that perhaps it could point to the fact that when people are part of a radical political group, perhaps the reason why it is mainly young men that perform the more violent acts. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that would be really that relevant to what we're talking about here. So,
well, there was an idea that terrorists are particularly poor and uneducated people. But we know now that that's not right. I mean, if you look just at the people who attacked on 9/11, the leadership element among them were from good middle and upper middle class families. Zawahiri is a doctor, a physician, a surgeon. Many jihadist terrorists have come out of engineering. So many that people even wonder, well, what is it about engineering that makes it jihadist? You know, it's true that sometimes you have poor people who join a terrorist group, and often they join for a status, to go back to where we were a minute ago. So in Colombia, we got cases, you know, the FARC, a militant group, comes to town. They've all got uniforms and guns, and they ask the young men, would anybody like to join us? Or young women too, for that matter. And we have cases where guys say, oh, yes. And then when you ask them, well, why did you join? Well, they all had guns, and I'd always wanted to have a gun in my hand. I'm fascinated with guns.
Mm-hmm. Right. So
I mean, in that case, the poorest people in town are thinking, well, gee, you know, here's a leg up in status, and I guess my meals are guaranteed, and maybe I'll get one of these uniforms. And so that appeals mostly to the poorest in a situation like you see in Colombia. But then there are other situations where terrorists come out of middle-class families.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the picture there is complicated, right?
It's complicated. There's no simple answer. Are they poor? No, not always. Are they rich? Well, no, not always.
Mm-hmm. Right. So let's just talk about one thing that perhaps it's the hardest to understand, at least when we're talking about things at a political level. That is the case of lone wolf terrorists and also people that self-sacrifice to obtain some sort of political goal or not. But I mean, what is the process there, and perhaps what are the mechanisms that operate on those people that lead them to self-sacrifice for a political cause?
Well, you got to remember that self-sacrifice for a political cause starts at a very low level. Anybody who gives money to a cause, that's a kind of a sacrifice. Mm-hmm. Anybody who goes to attend a march or a demonstration, that's a sacrifice of time and other things you could be doing, maybe even some risk. So self-sacrifice goes all the way for political causes. It goes all the way from kind of very minor kinds of activities like that, all the way up to being a terrorist or even a suicide bomber. So there's this great gamut, variety of risk that
right.
people get involved in. So how it happens at lower levels is not the same as how it happens at higher levels. So that's the first thing I wanted to say in response to your question about this is, well, you know, when we talk about self-sacrifice, we got to recognize that we're talking about a broad array of different kinds of sacrifices, and different kinds have different antecedents and different emotional experiences associated with them, and so on. So having said that, the case of the lone wolf terrorist, which is a particular that you mentioned, is a particularly difficult case because of the presumption of rational choice, which is dominant in our social science. Mm-hmm. So we usually talk about how people, especially young males, are brought to willingness to sacrifice. We usually talk about that by talking about institutional and organizational systems of reward and punishment. Mm-hmm. So we usually talk about how the reasons that soldiers stay and fight instead of running or cowering in a foxhole is because of the love they have for their buddies. And if they do less, the danger for their buddies is more. So we usually understand how people come to be ready to take risks for a cause as being part of a kind of a social network that has rewards and costs associated with different kinds of behaviors. You know, armies have institutional rewards and punishments. You can get more money or a decoration. You can go to jail for disobeying orders. You can be shot in time of war for disobeying orders. So we usually understand how individuals are capable of taking big risks and making self-sacrifice. We usually understand that in terms of organizational and group dynamics kinds of factors that produce a system of rewards and punishments that makes it seem like at any given time, I guess I better do it. But that doesn't work for the lone wolf terrorists. They don't belong to a group. They're not part of an organization. There's nobody standing over them with rewards and punishments. There's no buddies in it with them on whom they depend and to whom they owe. It's not like that. So it's a, psychologically speaking, it's a separate and difficult problem. How somebody would volunteer themselves as an individual alone to go perform act of political violence. And Sofia Moskalenko and I have tried we think we found two possible ways of understanding how that can happen. And one of them is what we call what is the right name we put on it now? It's the disordered and disconnected. People who are loners, and frequently have some mental health issues. I said earlier, terrorists are psychologically normal. That's 99% true when you're talking about members of a terrorist group. But when you're talking about these individuals, there are examples of people who have mental health issues, frequently depression, associated with being loners, and we don't know whether they're loners because they're depressed, or they're depressed on account of their loners, or maybe both ways happens, we're not sure. But a lot of the people that you see as lone wolf terrorists have this kind of a profile. They're loners and they got mental health issues. And so for them, you could say it's a kind of escape. Their life feels like hell. They're feeling bad. They're in pain. And so for them, taking some kind of a lone wolf attack is a way of escaping their pain and bidding for status. Going from zero to hero, as they say, in one step. So that's one kind of framework or profile for understanding how this can happen. But it's not enough. There are other kinds of people. Like there's a Canadian by the name of Momin Khawaja. His father had a PhD in political science from the University of Syracuse in the US, and became a very important and successful administrator of universities around the world, traveled. And so his son, this professor's son, Momin Khawaja, this is back right around the time of 9/11 attacks. He sees, he reads, he sees the news on television. He can see on the internet videos of Muslims suffering from Western powers. Suffering sometimes because the West supports authoritarian and repressive Muslim leaders. Sometimes suffering because the West supports Israel in its fight against the Palestinians. Suffering sometimes because of various military forces, Western military forces, who are involved in Muslim countries. And he feels just worse and worse about this. He cares. He's a Muslim. He's a good Muslim. He teaches kind of a Muslim Sunday school for boys. And so he cares. And the more he sees, the more he cares and the worse he feels. And he has these big arguments with his father. Mm-hmm. His father says, well, you know, Muslims around the world, we just have to be better organized, and we have to try to think how to advance our interests and in opposition to Western capitalist interests. So his father is counseling him, you know, we need to be careful, we need to be rational, we need to be thoughtful. And the son, with the impatience of youth, finally just can't stand that kind of counsel anymore. Mm-hmm. And so he basically volunteers himself. He goes to, right after the 9/11 this is, he goes to Afghanistan on his own money, mm-hmm. To try to join the Taliban to fight the U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Right. So I talk about him. Later he got in trouble, he's in jail now for a bomb plot. But the beginning of his radicalization in action, at the beginning of it, was going to try to fight in Afghanistan. And now, how did that happen? Was it because he was a loner? No, he was living in his family's very nice house. He had family living in the house with him and his mother, and he loved them and they loved him. He had friends. He had a great job. He'd paying like $100,000 a year, and this was 20 years ago, doing IT work for the Canadian government, no less. So is this a guy who is like disconnected and disordered? He has no sign of any mental disorder. He has all these social connections. He's a successful young man making serious money. And out of all of this success, somehow he goes to Afghanistan. And why does he do it? And I think it's because he's compelled by how much he cares. We call this profile caring compelled. There's some people who feel others' suffering so strongly and so personally, they just can't stand it. They got to do something. Now, this is a very hard thing. When I try to tell people this line of thought, I know that this is a very hard thing, because what it says is that it's the black side of empathy. We usually think of the capacity to sympathize and empathize as being a wonderful human thing, and it is. But for people who have it extra strong, it's a force for action, including violent action, if they think that's the only thing they can do. Mm-hmm. So you get people like that. So these are rare compared to if you look through the case histories of lone wolf terrorists, these caring compelled people are rare compared to the disconnected disordered, who are themselves rare compared to most terrorists, because most terrorists are part of some group. These people are the very rare ones who are acting by themselves. But we think that there are these two different profiles for trying to understand how a lone wolf terrorist could happen.
Mm-hmm. So, isn't it the case that in studying lone wolf terrorism, but perhaps also in studying all of these sorts of political radicalization phenomena that we're talking about here, one of the big problems is really that it's not easy for us to gather high numbers of subjects, and so the samples are small, and it's very difficult to establish the correct set of factors behind each of these types of phenomena, and also to establish a causal relationship between them.
Yeah, it's a tough line of work. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate how tough it is. It is possible to go and talk to terrorists. It used to be, if you wanted to talk to Irish Republican Army terrorists, there were a couple different bars that you could go to in Northern Ireland, Catholic bars, where these guys hung out. And some who had retired, they were still hanging out there. Some who were still active service members of the Republican Army, still active terrorists. You could go and talk with them. But the trouble is, you're not there when it's happening. You're getting a retrospective story. You're having people look back into their own histories and tell you why they did something at a particular point in the past, usually years past.
So you're also relying on their own reports?
Yes, but I mean, we're not very good at that, human beings. We have this, there's research on that we have as humans a great tendency to make sense of the past in a way that fits in with our present. And so,
there's also
you know, if you ask me,
related.
why did you go to West Point when you were 17 years old? Well, you know, I could tell you various things, but I'm not sure any of them are really an accurate representation of the person that I was when I was 17 years old. Am I really accurately, am I able? And I'm a psychologist. I'm supposed to be able to think about such things, but am I really able to go back into my 17-year-old mind and kind of rank order the important factors that led me to decide to go along with my friends, 3 or 4 of them from the same high school, to go to West Point? Well, I'm not sure I can. So yes, it's difficult, but it's not just the small numbers that makes the difficulty. It's the reliance almost always on some kind of a retrospective report. And we know that there's all kinds of systematic biases in self-report of past histories. So that's a problem.
Biases and also the fact that we tend to rewrite a little bit our memories every time we remember them. Right.
Yeah, we tend to make them like a simpler, cleaner, clearer story than what it might have seemed at the time. That's our rage for order. We want to understand ourselves. And so, of course, what this does is, when it comes to why did you join a militant group, what you get in retrospect is the story, the grievance story that was learned for many only after they joined the group. Hardly anybody says, oh, I joined because I always wanted to have a gun in my hand. I always wanted power. I joined because I was starving and it seemed like a good gig. No, I joined because I was lonely and these people offered me comradeship. People they're not going to look back over a life as a terrorist and say, well, I got into it for these kind of everyday self-serving reasons. They're going to come up with the storyline of we're oppressed, we're victimized, we have to fight back. They have to see what it's like, what we're suffering. So they come up with a kind of grievance story, most likely, to make sense of what they did. But how important was the grievance story at the time when they were actually joining? Well, I was trying to tell you, we've got some reason to think that there's mechanisms that have nothing to do with grievance that are important for many.
So when people try to explain these sorts of political radicalizations we've been talking about, many times they try to explain them on the basis of the ideology that is behind, for example, a political group. But I mean, is that really a good enough approach to try to look at the ideology and how the ideology might be influencing both the group and the individuals that compose it? Because the link between people's beliefs and their actions. I mean, it's not that straightforward. It's not always the case that particularly what people report as being their beliefs are really what's behind, in terms of motivations, what's behind their actions, right?
Yeah. Well, you're right that a very popular story in explaining radicalization is ideology. Mm-hmm. And especially that has been true of jihadist-style terrorism, mm-hmm. In which the popular, maybe even the favorite story is it's a particular form of fundamentalist, extremist Islam. It's this ideology of the jihadists that explains their actions and explains their radicalization. I think that this is almost entirely useless myself, this idea that it's ideology. It's bad ideas at the bottom of the bad action. The first thing to notice is that bad ideas are really common. I've done plenty of survey work myself and looked at other people's survey work, and around the world, in Western countries, here and in France and in Britain, it's something on the order of about half Muslims in Western countries believe that the war on terrorism is a war on Islam. You can say, well, that's a pretty radical idea. There's about 10% in the US and the UK, in particular, who say in polls that suicide bombing against civilians in defense of Islam is often or sometimes justified. Mm-hmm. That's really quite a radical idea, I would say. Well, 10% of US and UK Muslims, 10% of US Muslims amounts to like 100,000 people.
Right.
10% sounds like it's kind of minimal. Yeah, well, it's a minority viewpoint. Yes, that's true. But, you multiply it through by how many adult Muslims are there in the U.S., and you get something on the order of 100,000 people. So you got 100,000 people with this extreme, in my opinion, extremely radical idea. But we only have like hundreds or maybe even less than 1,000 anyway, cases of people in the U.S., Muslims, who actually did or tried to do some kind of terrorist act. Mm-hmm. So out of all the many who have an extreme idea, there's this tiny fraction, maybe 1%, who ever actually do anything. Mm-hmm. So that's the first weakness about this ideological explanation, is that there are lots of people with radical ideas who have done nothing and are not going to do anything, unless, of course, we target them in ways that makes them more extreme in action than they are already. We could create some new problems by targeting people inappropriately, targeting them for their ideas as opposed to targeting them for their actions, which is what the U.S. legal system is supposed to do. So that's the first weakness, is this one. And the second weakness we've already looked at. Not only is it very few with radical ideas who ever do anything, there's many without any radical ideas who get involved in some kind of violent group. So it's another way of thinking about the weakness of it. Mm-hmm. The third way of thinking about the weakness of it is, well, what are we to mean by ideology? We mean some careful, thought-through fundamentalist version of Islam. Most of the people that we catch up with as jihadist terrorists, they're not scholars of Islam. They don't know very much about Islam at all. So if by ideology you mean something like a well-organized system of political or religious ideas, if that's what you mean, I think we hardly ever see any ideology in the terrorists. It's
At least in terms of...
See, I don't consider I don't think a grievance is the same thing as ideology.
Mm-hmm.
To believe that there's a war on Islam, to believe that we're justified in fighting back, including suicide bombing if necessary, I don't consider that an ideology. I don't consider seeking revenge out of anger. I don't consider that an ideology. So this whole concept of ideology, that there's some kind of a wrong-headed version of Islam is at the bottom of the problem. That's a mistake, I think. What's at the bottom of the problem is the perception of U.S. policies and Western policies more generally in Muslim countries. That's what the problem is. And for that, you don't need an ideology. I mean, I don't think we should dignify an idea of revenge as ideology. So I find this whole concept of ideology as the explanation. I find this pretty much a complete waste of time.
And I don't know if these hypotheses, let's call it, holds any water, but would it make sense to perhaps suspect that at least many times what we call ideology is not really what's causing people's behavior, but perhaps when we ask people why they did something, they use what we call ideology as sort of a post hoc justification or rationalization to their behavior. That is, it comes after the fact and not exactly before it.
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier that many individuals only learn the narrative, the grievance narrative. They only learn it after they joined a militant group. They didn't join because they had this story. They learned the story after they joined, for a lot of people. So, yes, I think I'm agreeing with you.
Okay, so perhaps just one last question, and I guess this is going to be a difficult one, but from all of what we've been talking about during the interview and all the knowledge that you have about political radicalization, do you think that it would be possible for us to create a sort of set of guidelines of how to counter and prevent political radicalization?
Well, yes, there are a number of guidelines, I would say. The first one is that prevention is easier than suppression. So if you have a group of people who see themselves as ill-treated by the system in general and the government in particular, it would be a good idea to try to understand what is the nature of their concern, and is there anything we can do, not just talk, but is there anything we can do in practice that could help address their concerns and their feelings? Because it's a lot easier to do that at the beginning than to try to wait until you've got a terrorist group emerging from out of this group and then start trying to do something about that. So, and this has to do with the strategies in terms of policing. So the 70s radicals escalated into violence largely because of their experience being dealt with by the police. They'd be in a march, a peace march somewhere, and the police would come in with clubs and beat them up and dump them in jail. And, you know, this kind of a police riot, it was sometimes called, against the demonstrators. This is extremely dangerous. This creates martyrs, and it creates heroes, and it creates new extremists in reaction to the experience from the security people and the police. So you probably know, because she's a lot closer to you than I am, but Donatella Della Porta, who is an Italian scholar who has studied terrorism both in Italy and Germany for many years. in her book, she puts a lot of weight in trying to understand how did the terrorism arise. She puts a lot of weight on this kind of back and forth interaction between a political protest group on the one hand and the policing on the other hand. So that's something to be very careful about. Something that can be done toward prevention and maybe even toward de-radicalization of people who have already moved to violence is to admit that the problem is the violence experienced by Muslims around the world from Western policies and Western forces. Mm-hmm. So I recently learned about some people working in the British anti-extremism program. It's an aspect of the PREVENT program that you might have heard of. And these people, these practitioners, the people who are talking to young British Muslims who are either already radicalized to some kind of extremist act or violence, some kind of illegal form of behavior, or maybe are just seen as at risk of going in that direction. And what these practitioners have learned to say is, yeah, you're right. It's terrible. Nobody should move into other people's countries and undermine the political process to prop up repressive dictators in Muslim countries. They shouldn't be setting down foreign military forces in Muslim countries. It's wrong. It's bad. Nobody would like that. But now let's talk about what to do about it. What's the best thing to do about it? Is violence going to help reduce this problem? So instead of denying the grievance, they have learned to agree with the grievance and then just talk about the means. Is violence a useful means? Has it helped in the past? Is it going to help in the future? Is this really the best thing that you could do for the people that you care about, you see is suffering? Yes, I'm ready to agree with you that they're suffering and it's unfair and it's terrible. Yes, but now the question is, like, what? What is the best thing for you to do? Mm-hmm. That they seem to make a better success out of that. And there's a whole book down this line by Stephanie Dornschneider, and I can't remember the title right now, but it's basically her interviews with activists and radicals, that is to say, legal and illegal political actors in Egypt and in Germany, leftist radicals from the 70s and 80s in Germany, mm-hmm. and jihadist or legal protesters for the Muslim cause in Egypt. So she interviews these people, and what is the big difference between the ones who are doing violence and the ones who are not? It's not the cause. They both agree. The government, Egypt in the one case, Germany in the other case, the government is repressive, it's heavy-handed, it's victimizing, it's hurting, it's killing, it's torturing, it's terrible. They all agree to that, both the activists and the radicals, both the legal and the illegal. Mm-hmm. But the ones who are sticking to the legal, they have developed views about what works, and about who the victims are when the conflict turns to violence, about how many innocent people on both sides mm-hmm. are injured and victimized when the conflict is escalated to violence. So you see, the difference that Dornschneider found, it's the same difference that these people in the Prevent program in England found, that the way to argue about this is not to argue about how you don't really have a grievance. The West hasn't hurt any Muslim. Don't do that. You can't win on that. It's too easy to find things on the internet where you get to see small children killed and injured, and shell fragments with stamped with "Made in USA" in the remains of the bomb that hit this house. It's too easy to find things like that. You can't hope to win arguing that you're just crazy to have this grievance. But what you can argue, and what I think is the more effective line that we should be trying to pursue, is, well, what's to be done about it, and is violence really going to help?
Mm-hmm. So it also entails perhaps acknowledging people's problems, or at least the things that people are worried about, instead of just dismissing them as being some sort of a conspiracy theory or something that is not really real. I mean, it's important really, if people say that they worried about something, to acknowledge those worries and to try to dialogue with people and to perhaps bring them to a more sensible position or approach to things.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So
better than trying to deny that the U.S. is running an empire, for instance, with I think it's over 80 countries that the U.S. has armed forces in now, right now, today.
Mm-hmm. And that would also serve for cases like people joining groups of extremists, like white nationalists and things like that, because they're worried about immigrants and things like that. I mean, it's not that the problem doesn't exist, it's that perhaps they are exaggerating it a little bit, and because mainstream politicians don't want to address the problem properly, then people turn to the extreme side of the political spectrum, because those are probably the people that are paying attention to those same problems.
Yeah, you've just described how President Trump was elected.
Right.
And mainstream politicians, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans, were ready to acknowledge that there is a broad swath of Americans who haven't had a raise for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
economically, they're not succeeding. They're not progressing the way their parents did. Socially, they see various kinds of minorities getting ahead of them with government help. Mm-hmm. They see a flood of immigrants of different colors and different beliefs and different cultures flooding into their country, and they're upset about these things. And the mainline politicians, neither Democrat nor Republican, were willing to acknowledge these as problems. Oh, don't you worry. The economists tell us that international trade is good for everybody, and international migration is good, and new citizens who are a country. Anyway, they denied it, basically. They just said, you're crazy to have these concerns. You've been listening to ignorant people, and you are ignorant people. After enough years of being thus ignored, they turned to Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm. So basically politicians who resort to that kind of discourse, let's say, where they simply dismiss people's problems and say that they're stupid, they are basically politically alienating them.
Yeah, well, positively. Mm-hmm. And you can get away with that in a strong state like the U.S. is, with a lot of nationalism and a lot of patriotism. You can get away with that for most of a generation, or maybe even two. But sooner or later, it's going to catch up with you. Mm-hmm. So it caught up with us. Mm-hmm. We haven't seen the end of that yet. But it's not only us, as you were pointing out. The anti-immigrant and right-wing nationalists and ethnic nationalist parties are progressing all across Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that now there are only 2 or 3 countries, one of them is Portugal, that don't have extreme right parties with a parliamentary seat or something like that.
I should study Portugal and find out why not.
Yeah, maybe that would be interesting. So,
I mean, do you have immigrants? Have you had a significant number of immigrants or refugees in Portugal?
During these last few years, with the influx of Muslim immigrants to Europe, no, not at all. Just a few thousand, but not something that's really worth talking about. So.
But Portugal has been slower than some other European countries to recover from the economic downturn of 2008 and 9, right?
Yeah, so that's also true, yeah.
So you could say that economically, there is still the remains of some crisis in the country. But I guess people are seeing things getting better, just more slowly than some other countries. Is that right? Mm-hmm. See, now I'm querying you because I really would like to. I didn't know this about Portugal till you told it to me a minute ago. So now I'm really quite interested in how Portugal has been preserved from these difficulties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, particularly with the present government that we have. I mean, they moved away from austerity measures, and some of the indices, the social, economic, political indices, they improved a little bit. So, I mean, I'm not sure about how people look at things in terms if they are a bit happier or not since the economic crisis, if that's been improving on that level or not. I'm not exactly sure about that, but at least in terms of economics and some social issues, it's been improving a little bit over the past 4 years or so. Yeah.
So do they do Euro polls in Portugal?
Yes, they
do. So I could find those, and then I would maybe be able to see some differences in the poll trajectories in Portugal compared to, say, Italy or Poland or anyway. So, okay, that's good. I learned something important, valuable here. Thank you.
Okay, great. So just before we go, would you like to tell people what are some of the best places on the internet for them to find your work?
Well, there's a number of my papers that are available on the START Center website. That's START. It's at the University of Maryland. START UMD-EDU. I think will do it. And then there are some of our papers that are published in a journal, but available free without paying at the journal. Right this minute, I don't have a list of those at the top of my head. But if you just Google my name and terrorism, you're going to find a lot of papers that are accessible without having to pay for it. Mm-hmm. And besides which, you could always email me, and I send papers to people all the time. Not everybody's ready to pay the money to subscribe to a journal in order to get 1 or 2 papers out of that. So I try to be as responsive as I can to people who are asking for a copy of a paper.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. So I will be leaving all of that in the description box of the video for people to go and check it out. And Dr. McCauley, it was really a pleasure to have you on the show, and thank you again for taking the time.
Ricardo, you gave me 3 chances thanks to my boggling the first 2, and I'm very glad to have been able to join in with you today.
Hello everybody, thank you so much for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel on February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1 would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. You also have the alternative of supporting me on Subscribestar or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Peruga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, Jan Haninen, and my two producers, these are Webb and Rosie. Thank you for all.